For thousands of years, humanity has accepted a familiar origin story, a perfect garden, a forbidden choice, and a fall that defined our nature forever. It is one of the most widely taught narratives in human history, shaping how billions understand morality, guilt, and human limitation. Yet when this story is examined closely, outside of tradition and beyond theology, it begins to fracture. Beneath its polished surface lies a far older framework, one that predates the Bible itself and points to a radically different understanding of our beginnings. When archaeologists began translating ancient clay tablets recovered from Mesopotamia, they encountered something unsettling. These texts, buried for millennia beneath the sands of modern Iraq, describe divine gardens, sacred trees, serpentine figures linked to wisdom, and disputes over human knowledge and mortality. The similarities to Genesis were not vague echoes, they were structural matches. And these stories were written more than 1,000 years before the Hebrew scriptures took their final form. This discovery forced scholars to confront an uncomfortable reality: the Genesis account did not emerge in isolation. During the Babylonian exile, Hebrew scribes lived among cultures that preserved vast libraries of ancient mythological and theological material. These were not obscure legends, they were central religious narratives, recited publicly and stored in temple archives. The adaptation of these older stories into a new theological framework appears deliberate, not accidental. What traditional theology later framed as original sin there may not have originally been about human moral failure at all. Earlier versions focus instead on disputes among powerful beings, arguments over how intelligent humans should become, how long they should live, and whether certain knowledge should remain forbidden. Humans were not the primary decision-makers in these accounts. They were the subject of debate, caught between competing authorities with very different agendas. If this is true, then the story we inherited is not the original story, it is a revised one. And that realization opens a door most people never realize existed. But if humans were never the villains of this story, then who was really in control, and why was the narrative changed? Long before the biblical texts were assembled into their familiar form, the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia preserved a very different explanation for why humanity exists the way it does. These accounts do not describe a single, unified divine will guiding human destiny. Instead, they present a fractured hierarchy of powerful beings engaged in ongoing disagreement about what humanity should become. At the center of this dispute stand two figures whose opposing philosophies shaped the limits of human existence itself. One of these beings was Enlil, a figure consistently associated with authority, enforcement, and cosmic regulation. In Sumerian and Babylonian texts, Enlil is not portrayed as a creator driven by affection or curiosity. He is an administrator. His role is to maintain order, enforce boundaries, and ensure that the system functions according to established rules. Humanity, in Enlil's worldview, exists to serve a purpose. Humans are workers, maintainers of the world, a labor force created to relieve the burden placed upon the divine hierarchy. Enki represents the opposite orientation. He is described as intelligent, inventive, and deeply involved in the practical realities of creation. While Enlil governs from above, Enki operates close to the material world. He understands systems, processes, and consequences. Most significantly, the ancient texts consistently credit Enki, not Enlil, with humanity's design. Humans are shaped through Enki's ingenuity, combining earthly material with something more subtle: awareness, reasoning, and adaptability. This difference in perspective creates immediate tension. Enlil sees humanity as functional. Enki sees humanity as developmental. To Enlil, increasing intelligence is dangerous. Knowledge creates unpredictability. Self-awareness creates resistance. Long lifespans allow experience to accumulate beyond control. Enlil's priority is stability, even if that stability requires limitation. Enki, however, appears to view human potential as unfinished. In his actions, humanity is not meant to remain static. Growth is not a threat, it is the point. The Mesopotamian flood narratives expose this conflict with remarkable clarity. When humans become too numerous, too loud, or too disruptive, Enlil interprets this not as success, but as failure. The solution he proposes is not reform or guidance, but reduction. Plagues are introduced. Famine follows. Eventually, the decision is made to erase humanity entirely through a catastrophic flood. This is not framed as moral punishment. It is population control. Enki's response is quiet, calculated, and deliberate. Bound by oath not to openly oppose the divine counsel, he finds indirect ways to intervene. He warns a human of what is coming. He provides instructions precise enough to preserve life beyond the catastrophe. Enki does not ask permission. He circumvents authority. His actions reveal that even within the divine hierarchy, consensus does not exist. When the flood subsides and humanity survives, Enlil's frustration does not end. Instead, new restrictions are imposed. Human lifespan is dramatically reduced. Infant mortality is introduced. Reproduction is limited. Certain women are designated to never bear children. These measures are not responses to sin. They are administrative controls. Humanity must remain manageable. This framework transforms how later stories should be understood. When Genesis describes humans losing immortality, struggling against the land, suffering in childbirth, and being expelled from a privileged environment, these outcomes align exactly with the limitations imposed by Enlil in older Mesopotamian accounts. What later theology describes as punishment for disobedience mirrors earlier systems of containment imposed after humanity gained too much capacity. The serpent in the garden is often framed as a deceiver, but within the older symbolic system, serpents represent knowledge, renewal, and transformation. In Mesopotamian iconography, serpent beings are guardians of sacred wisdom. They are not enemies of humanity. They are intermediaries. When a serpentine figure encourages humans to acquire knowledge, it aligns perfectly with Enki's repeated role as the provider of forbidden understanding. The statement attributed to the serpent, that humans would become like the gods by acquiring knowledge, is not portrayed as false within the narrative itself. The text later confirms it. Humans do gain expanded awareness. The fear expressed afterward is not that humans were deceived, but that they now possess something dangerous. The human has become like one of us. This is not regret over a lie, it is concern over parity. This moment reveals the true tension underlying the story. Knowledge was not forbidden because it was harmful to humans. It was forbidden because it reduced the gap between humans and those who governed them. The acquisition of knowledge threatened hierarchy. And hierarchy, once threatened, responded with restriction. Across Mesopotamian literature, this theme repeats relentlessly. A hero seeks immortality and loses it through intervention. A plant of life is stolen away. Longevity is reserved for a select few. Humans approach the threshold of transcendence, only to be pulled back. These are not morality tales. They are accounts of denial. Something is withheld, repeatedly and deliberately. When Hebrew scribes adapted these narratives centuries later, the framework was simplified. Multiple beings became one. Conflicts among divine authorities became tests of obedience. Administrative control became moral judgment. What had once been a political struggle within a divine hierarchy transformed into a story about human failure. This transformation served a purpose. A story where humans are inherently flawed justifies authority. A story where suffering is deserved discourages resistance. A story where knowledge leads to punishment teaches obedience. The older narrative, by contrast, suggests that limitation was imposed, not earned. The implications are unsettling. If humanity's reduced lifespan, struggle, and suffering were not the result of moral collapse but of imposed restriction, then the foundation of many later doctrines begins to shift. The concept of inherited corruption loses coherence. The idea that humans must be saved from themselves becomes questionable. What if humanity was never broken, only restrained? This question does not accuse or excuse. It reframes. Humans in the older accounts are neither heroes nor villains. They are participants in a larger system they did not design. Their fate is shaped by beings with competing visions of what humanity should be allowed to become. One vision values control. The other values expansion. Even the flood itself takes on new meaning. Rather than divine wrath against sin, it appears as a reset, a failed attempt to undo an experiment that had advanced too far. The survival of humanity is not the result of righteousness alone, but of intervention by a protector who believed the experiment was worth saving. These themes were not lost accidentally. They were buried beneath layers of reinterpretation. Over time, the original conflict faded from public awareness, replaced by a cleaner narrative with a single authority and a single moral lesson. Yet the seams remain visible. The parallels are too consistent. The structure too precise. The echoes too persistent to dismiss as coincidence. The question that emerges is not whether these older stories influence later texts. That influence is widely acknowledged in academic circles. The deeper question is why the nature of the conflict was obscured. Why the focus shifted from power struggles among divine beings to guilt within humanity. Why knowledge itself became framed as dangerous rather than transformative. Perhaps because a humanity that believes it is fallen will accept limits without question. Perhaps because a humanity taught that suffering is deserved will not ask who imposed it. And perhaps because a humanity discouraged from seeking knowledge will never challenge the structures that confine it. If this interpretation is even partially accurate, then the story of human origins is not a tragedy of failure. It is a history of containment. And containment implies something worth containing. If humanity was deliberately limited, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Who was enforcing those limits, how many were involved, and why does the language of the texts themselves still betray their presence? At the very opening of the Hebrew Bible, a quiet inconsistency appears, one so subtle that most readers pass over it without notice, yet so persistent that it reshapes the entire foundation of biblical theology once recognized. The word translated into English as God is not singular. It never was. The Hebrew term is Elohim, and grammatically, linguistically, and structurally, it is plural. This is not speculation. It is not fringe interpretation. It is basic Hebrew grammar. In the Hebrew language, plural masculine nouns end with the suffix im. This rule is consistent and universal. A single cherub becomes multiple cherubim. A single seraph becomes seraphim. In the same way, the singular term Eloah, meaning a powerful one, becomes Elohim when referring to more than one. This plural form appears more than 2,000 times throughout the Hebrew scriptures. And yet, in the vast majority of English translations, it is rendered as a singular entity. This translation choice is not neutral. It is theological. It reflects decisions made long after the texts were written, shaped by evolving doctrines that insisted on absolute monotheism. But the original authors were not writing with later theology in mind. They were writing within a worldview that assumed the existence of multiple powerful beings operating within a structured hierarchy. This becomes unmistakable when the text is allowed to speak for itself. In Genesis, Elohim says, "Let us make humanity in our image, according to our likeness." The sentence does not read, "let me." The pronouns are plural. Traditional explanations claim this refers to angels, or to an internal divine dialogue, or, retroactively, to the Trinity. None of these interpretations exist within the cultural or linguistic context of the original writers. They are later solutions imposed to resolve an inherited discomfort. The plural language does not disappear after creation. It intensifies. After humanity acquires knowledge, the text records a troubling statement: the human has become like one of us. Not like me. Not like God alone. Like one member of a group. The text acknowledges a collective category of beings to which humanity is approaching similarity. This pattern extends far beyond Genesis. Psalm 82 presents perhaps the clearest and most unsettling example. The passage opens with Elohim standing in the assembly of Elohim, judging among the Elohim. One being presides. Others are evaluated. They are criticized for injustice, warned of consequences, and told that despite their elevated status, they will eventually perish like humans. This is not metaphorical poetry. It is administrative language. It describes governance, accountability, and hierarchy. The concept underlying these passages is known to scholars as the Divine Council. This was not unique to Israel. Every major culture of the ancient Near East described a supreme authority presiding over an assembly of lesser but still powerful beings. The Ugaritic texts discovered in the 20th century describe the Council of El in language strikingly similar to the Hebrew Bible. Mesopotamian texts describe assemblies of the Anunnaki performing the same functions. The Israelite tradition did not invent this model. It inherited and adapted it. One of the most revealing passages appears in Deuteronomy 32, preserved in its older form in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Greek Septuagint. The text states that when the Most High divided humanity, he assigned nations according to the number of the sons of Elohim. Each nation was allotted to a divine being. Israel, in this framework, was assigned to Yahweh. Later Hebrew manuscripts altered this phrase to sons of Israel, eliminating the reference to multiple divine rulers. The edit is detectable. The motivation is clear. This allocation of nations explains numerous otherwise puzzling statements. When Yahweh calls Israel his inheritance, the phrase implies other inheritances existed. When the text condemns Israelites for worshipping other gods, it does not deny the existence of those beings. It condemns loyalty violations. The early texts treat other Elohim as real entities associated with real peoples. Chemosh is Moab's god. Dagon belongs to the Philistines. Their existence is assumed, not mocked. Even verb forms betray the original worldview. In several passages, Elohim is paired with plural verbs, something translators routinely ignore. When Abraham explains that Elohim caused him to wander, the verb is plural. When the medium at Ender describes seeing Elohim rising from the earth, she sees multiple figures. Samuel appears as one among them. The text does not correct her. It affirms her vision. This plural framework creates a radically different understanding of Yahweh himself. Yahweh is not introduced as the only Elohim in existence. He is introduced as one Elohim among others, distinct not by ontological uniqueness, but by relationship. He is Israel's Elohim. His authority is real, but it is not solitary. The name Yahweh itself reinforces this. It derives from a Hebrew root meaning to be or to become. When Moses asks for the divine name, the response is not a label but a description of existence in motion. I will be what I will be. The third-person form, Yahweh, means he is or he becomes. It is not the name of an abstract infinite principle. It is the designation of a specific being operating in time and space. The texts describe Yahweh in remarkably concrete terms. He appears, travels, arrives, and departs. He occupies locations. He descends onto mountains in fire and smoke. He requires a dwelling built to exact specifications. He consumes offerings described as pleasing aromas. These are not symbolic gestures. They are operational details. The narrative repeatedly depicts Yahweh interacting with other members of the divine council. In the book of Job, the sons of Elohim present themselves before Yahweh. One among them acts as an adversarial figure. They converse. They negotiate boundaries. In 1 Kings, a prophetic vision describes Yahweh seated on a throne, surrounded by the host of heaven. A strategy is proposed. Discussion occurs. A plan is approved. This is governance, not abstraction. The title, often translated as Lord of Hosts, further clarifies this role. The Hebrew term refers to organized forces, armies, divisions, ranks. Yahweh commands structured aerial forces. He is a military leader within a larger hierarchy. The language is operational, not mystical. Over time, this concrete portrayal became increasingly uncomfortable for later theologians influenced by Greek philosophy. Platonic concepts of immaterial perfection were incompatible with a God who eats, walks, and resides in tents. The solution was reinterpretation. Physical descriptions became metaphor. Council scenes became literary devices. Plural language became honorary singularity. The transformation was gradual, but deliberate. The result is a profound disconnect between the text and its interpretation. Modern readers encounter a philosophical God of infinite abstraction while reading documents that describe a localized authority figure embedded within a structured cosmic administration. The tension is resolved not by the text, but by tradition. Why did this shift occur? Because a single, infinite, unchallengeable deity supports centralized authority. A divine council implies distributed power. Distributed power implies alternative access points to legitimacy. That is dangerous to institutions built on exclusivity. If multiple Elohim exist, then multiple priesthoods could claim authority. Multiple temples could be valid. Multiple interpretations could coexist. Monotheism, as later defined, eliminated that complexity. It simplified the system and concentrated power. Yet the original language could not be fully erased. The plural nouns remain. The plural verbs remain. The council scenes remain. The older worldview persists beneath the surface, detectable to anyone willing to examine the text without inherited assumptions. This does not diminish the texts. It enriches them. It reveals that the biblical authors were not naive or unsophisticated. They were operating within a cosmology that recognized layered reality, competing authorities, and humanity's contested position within that structure. And this realization leads directly to an even more unsettling question. If Yahweh was not the highest authority, if he operated within a larger hierarchy, then who stood above him? Who defined the boundaries of the system itself? And what role did humanity play within that larger design? Because once the existence of the divine council is acknowledged, the focus must shift upward, to the authority above the gods, the forces beyond the council, and the reason humanity was placed at the center of a conflict far larger than any single tradition admits. Once the existence of a divine council is acknowledged, the structure of ancient belief systems changes fundamentally. The biblical world is no longer populated by a single, solitary deity operating in isolation. Instead, it reveals a layered hierarchy of authority, responsibility, and power. And at the top of that hierarchy stands a figure whose presence is both subtle and disruptive, the being referred to as the Most High. This title appears throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, often without explanation, as if its meaning were assumed rather than introduced. The Most High is not always interchangeable with Yahweh. In several passages, the distinction between them is explicit. The Most High assigns territories. The Most High establishes boundaries. The Most High distributes authority. Yahweh, by contrast, governs a specific domain within that system. This distinction is easy to overlook if one assumes all divine titles refer to the same being. But when read without that assumption, the hierarchy becomes visible. Deuteronomy 32 provides the clearest window into this structure. In its older textual form, preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls and early Greek translations, the passage describes the Most High dividing humanity among the sons of Elohim. Each nation receives a divine ruler. Israel is given to Yahweh as his inheritance. This arrangement presupposes a system of delegated authority. The Most High acts as allocator. Yahweh acts as regional governor. This model aligns perfectly with other ancient Near Eastern cosmologies. Supreme authority rests with a high god who presides over a council of subordinate beings, each responsible for specific territories or functions. In Mesopotamian texts, Anu occupies this role above Enlil and Enki. In Ugaritic texts, El presides over the assembly while Baal governs particular domains. The Israelite version fits squarely within this pattern. Yet later theology flattened this hierarchy. Titles were merged. Distinctions blurred. The Most High became synonymous with Yahweh in popular interpretation, even when the text itself maintained separation. This theological compression served an important purpose. It eliminated ambiguity. It removed the possibility of authority above the national deity. It transformed Yahweh from a participant in a system into the system itself. The Hebrew Scriptures, however, never fully cooperate with this simplification. Passages continue to surface that resist harmonization. Psalm 82 does not depict Yahweh as the ultimate source of authority. It depicts him standing within an assembly and pronouncing judgment. Judgment implies accountability. Accountability implies higher standards. The beings judged are called Elohim, and Yahweh is one of them, elevated but not alone. Even the language used to describe Yahweh's rise hints at a developmental narrative. He is not introduced as eternal ruler of all existence. He emerges historically. He enters into covenant. He establishes territory. He battles rival powers. These are the actions of a being consolidating authority, not one who has always possessed it uncontested. The prophets preserve echoes of this struggle. Isaiah speaks of a divine figure falling from the heights, cast down after attempting to ascend too far. Later tradition transformed this into a story about a rebellious angel. But the original language does not require such an interpretation. It speaks instead of a ruler over nations who sought elevation beyond his assigned domain. This brings us to the uncomfortable question: what happens when a delegated authority exceeds its mandate? In human systems, such actions result in conflict, rebellion, and reform. There is no reason to assume cosmic systems operate differently. The Hebrew scriptures themselves record multiple moments of divine realignment, judgment, and restructuring. The flood narrative marks one such moment. The destruction is not described as the whim of a single deity acting alone. It follows deliberation. It follows disagreement. It follows intervention by a dissenting figure who works to preserve life despite the decision of the council. After the flood, the system changes. Lifespans shorten. Access is restricted. Boundaries harden. Humanity becomes more tightly managed. But the restructuring does not stop there. Over centuries, further consolidation occurs. Local divine figures fade from prominence. Their worship is suppressed. Their names are demonized. Their temples are destroyed. This process reaches its peak during the Deuteronomic reforms of the 7th century BCE. Under kings Hezekiah and Josiah, Judah undergoes a radical transformation. Altars outside Jerusalem are dismantled. Sacred pillars are smashed. Competing priesthoods are eliminated. Worship is centralized. One temple becomes legitimate. One priesthood gains exclusive authority. One interpretation of Yahweh's will becomes law. The text frames these actions as purification. From another perspective, they represent consolidation. Religious diversity is not merely discouraged, it is eradicated. The reform does not argue against the existence of other Elohim. It forbids their worship. Loyalty becomes the issue, not ontology. The economic implications are enormous. Centralization of worship means centralization of offerings. Resources that once supported multiple shrines now flow into a single institution. Power follows wealth. Authority becomes enforceable. Theology becomes policy. Texts that contradict this new order become dangerous. References to divine plurality must be reinterpreted. Passages implying authority above Yahweh must be softened or altered. Older traditions must be reframed as error or heresy. This is not speculation. Manuscript evidence demonstrates deliberate textual modification. The Masoretic text, standardized centuries later, removes or obscures references preserved in earlier sources. Sons of Elohim becomes Sons of Israel. Ambiguity is eliminated. The divine counsel recedes into abstraction. What remains is a narrative that supports centralized control. This process repeats across cultures. When religious authority aligns with political power, plurality becomes a threat. Competing narratives undermine legitimacy. Multiple access points to the divine weaken institutional monopoly. The solution is always the same: simplify, centralize, suppress. Yet suppression never fully succeeds. Traces remain. Linguistic anomalies persist. Inconvenient passages survive. Stories circulate at the margins. Prophets challenge authority. Wisdom traditions emphasize knowledge over obedience. The tension never disappears. Even within the canonical texts, Yahweh is occasionally depicted as constrained by higher law. He swears by something greater than himself. He appeals to ancient decrees. He references covenants older than Israel. These moments suggest participation in a system governed by rules not entirely of his making. The figure of the Most High functions as a reminder of that system. Rarely depicted directly, never fully explained, always present in the background, the Most High represents ultimate authority beyond any single deity. This being does not walk among humans, does not demand offerings, does not appear in fire or smoke. The Most High governs indirectly, through structure rather than spectacle. This distinction matters. A God who demands ritual participation requires proximity. A God who allocates authority operates at a different level. The Most High is not concerned with daily obedience. He is concerned with order, with balance, with boundaries. If this framework is correct, then the biblical story is not one of simple monotheism evolving naturally. It is the record of a political struggle within the divine realm, mirrored by struggles on earth. Authority is contested. Power is consolidated. Narratives are reshaped. Humanity's role within this system becomes clearer. Humans are not merely worshippers. They are assets. Nations are territories. Loyalty matters because allegiance has consequences within a larger hierarchy. Knowledge matters because it enables autonomy. Autonomy threatens centralized control. This perspective explains why access to knowledge is repeatedly restricted. Why prophets who speak too freely are silenced. Why wisdom traditions are marginalized. Why dissent is framed as rebellion against the divine itself. It also explains why later theological developments emphasize submission over understanding, faith over inquiry, obedience over insight. A controlled population is easier to govern, whether by human kings or divine authorities. And yet, the texts themselves preserve a countercurrent. Wisdom literature celebrates understanding. Prophets question divine decisions. Figures like Job challenge authority directly. Abraham argues with Yahweh. Moses negotiates. These stories make little sense in a framework where one unquestionable being rules all. They make perfect sense in a system where authority is real but not absolute. The existence of the Most High implies that even gods operate within limits. That power is structured. That hierarchy exists. And that humanity, positioned at the intersection of these forces, has always been more than passive. This realization brings us to a critical turning point. If authority above Yahweh exists, and if power was consolidated through reform and suppression, then what knowledge was lost in the process? What traditions were erased? What truths became dangerous? Because once control of divine narrative is established, control of human destiny follows. To understand how deeply this control extended, we must follow the trail beyond scripture, into burned libraries, forbidden books, silenced cultures, and the systematic erasure of alternative memories that once told a very different story of humanity's place in the cosmos. The consolidation of divine authority described in earlier traditions did not remain confined to theology. It expressed itself materially, politically, and violently across human history. Once power, whether divine or institutional, was centralized, the next logical step was control of memory. Knowledge that contradicted the sanctioned narrative did not simply fade away through neglect. It was actively targeted, systematically dismantled, and in many cases, deliberately destroyed. The erasure of alternative histories was not accidental. It was strategic. The Hebrew scriptures themselves document one of the earliest large-scale examples of this process. During the reforms of the 7th century BCE, religious diversity within Judah was not merely discouraged, it was eradicated. High places were torn down. Sacred pillars were smashed. Objects associated with other Elohim were removed from the central temple. Priests who served outside the approved system were deposed. This was not theological debate, it was enforced standardization. These reforms were justified as purification, but their effects were unmistakably political. When worship is centralized, authority follows. When authority follows, wealth follows. And when wealth follows, dissent becomes dangerous. Competing traditions represent competing power structures. Eliminating them simplifies governance. Texts that reflected older pluralistic understandings could not simply be argued against, they had to be neutralized. Some were reinterpreted. Others were quietly excluded. Still others were destroyed outright. The narrative that survived was the one that aligned with centralized authority and institutional continuity. This pattern did not end in the ancient Near East. It repeated wherever religious authority fused with state power. In each case, suppression followed the same logic: eliminate rival cosmologies, delegitimize indigenous knowledge, and replace local memory with a universalized doctrine that positioned the ruling institution as the sole mediator of truth. By the time Christianity emerged as a state religion in the Roman Empire, this logic was already well established. Early Christianity was not monolithic. It consisted of numerous communities with radically different understandings of cosmology, salvation, and the nature of divine beings. Some emphasized direct knowledge. Others preserved traditions of divine plurality. Still others described humanity as capable of spiritual ascent without institutional mediation. These groups did not disappear because their ideas were disproven. They disappeared because they were suppressed. Once Christianity gained imperial backing under Constantine, theological disagreement became a threat to political unity. Councils were convened not to explore truth, but to enforce uniformity. Texts that aligned with approved doctrine were preserved. Those that did not were labeled heretical. Possession of forbidden writings became punishable. Over time, entire traditions vanished from public awareness. The destruction of texts was not symbolic. Libraries were burned. Scrolls were seized. Knowledge systems that had developed over centuries were eliminated within a generation. What survived did so largely by chance or concealment. This same mechanism operated far beyond the Mediterranean world. When European powers expanded across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, religious conquest accompanied military conquest. Indigenous cosmologies were not studied neutrally, they were evaluated for threat potential. Those that challenged European theological assumptions were systematically dismantled. In Mesoamerica, the Maya maintained vast libraries of codices containing astronomical records, historical accounts, and detailed cosmologies. These texts preserved memories of world ages, celestial beings, and cycles of destruction and renewal. To the conquistadors and missionaries who encountered them, this knowledge represented a problem. It demonstrated sophistication. It contradicted the narrative of indigenous inferiority. It suggested ancient wisdom independent of Europe. The response was eradication. Thousands of manuscripts were burned in public ceremonies. Only a handful survived. An entire civilization's written memory was reduced to fragments. The loss was irreversible. Similar patterns unfolded elsewhere. In the Andes, systems of record-keeping were dismantled. In North America, ceremonial traditions were outlawed. Oral histories were interrupted through forced assimilation. Children were removed from their communities and forbidden to learn ancestral languages. Knowledge transmission was broken deliberately. These actions were not motivated by ignorance. They were motivated by control. Colonial authorities understood that identity is rooted in memory. To reshape a people, one must reshape their understanding of who they are and where they come from. Origin stories were particularly dangerous. They define possibility. They establish precedent. They anchor meaning beyond imposed authority. Thus, origin stories were targeted first. Across continents, indigenous accounts described powerful beings interacting with humanity in ancient times. These beings were not abstract gods. They were teachers, lawgivers, and sometimes adversaries. They arrived from the sky. They departed. They intervened during catastrophes. These accounts directly contradicted the idea that all spiritual authority flowed from a single institution or tradition. So they were dismissed as mythology, or demonized, or erased. The pattern extends into early modern Europe as well. The Renaissance did not merely revive classical knowledge, it threatened ecclesiastical monopoly. Scholars rediscovered ancient texts that contradicted biblical chronology. Astronomers proposed models that displaced humanity from the center of creation. Philosophers questioned inherited assumptions about divine nature. The institutional response was swift and severe. Books were banned. Thinkers were imprisoned. Some were executed. The message was clear: certain questions were not allowed. The case of Giordano Bruno illustrates this dynamic with brutal clarity. Bruno did not merely propose a heliocentric system. He argued for an infinite universe populated by countless worlds. This was not simply a scientific claim, it was a theological threat. A populated universe undermines exclusivity. It destabilizes doctrines built on human centrality. Bruno's execution was not an anomaly. It was a warning. Afterward, thinkers learned to self-censor. Dangerous ideas were coded, delayed, or abandoned. Knowledge advanced cautiously, constrained by invisible boundaries enforced through fear. By the time the modern world emerged, the architecture of suppression was already deeply embedded. Institutions had learned how to control information without burning libraries. Access restrictions replaced public destruction. Classification replaced prohibition. Complexity replaced clarity. Knowledge was no longer erased openly. It was buried. Archives became inaccessible. Manuscripts were catalogued in ways that obscured their content. Scholars required permission to view materials, and permission could be revoked. Control became bureaucratic rather than violent, but no less effective. The cumulative effect of this process is staggering. Humanity's understanding of its own past has been filtered repeatedly through systems designed to preserve authority. What survives is not necessarily what was true, but what was permitted. And yet, suppression is never total. Fragments remain. Parallels persist across cultures. Patterns emerge where independent traditions converge on the same themes: catastrophic resets, powerful beings, lost knowledge, and imposed limits. These convergences are not random. They suggest shared memory rather than coincidence. Which raises an unavoidable question: if so much effort was invested in erasing alternative histories, what exactly were those histories threatening? Because institutions do not destroy knowledge that is harmless. They destroy knowledge that destabilizes power. To understand what was considered so dangerous, we must follow the fragments that survived, hidden in forbidden texts, marginalized traditions, and global memories that refuse to disappear, even after centuries of deliberate erasure. When suppression fails to erase knowledge completely, it changes strategy. Destruction gives way to containment. What cannot be eliminated is hidden. What cannot be hidden is reframed. And what cannot be reframed is labeled dangerous, symbolic, or irrelevant. This is the stage at which forbidden knowledge becomes classified rather than burned, archived rather than shared, and preserved only for those deemed capable of handling its implications. Throughout history, religious and political institutions have demonstrated remarkable consistency in how they manage threatening information. Texts that directly contradict official narratives are rarely debated openly. Instead, access to them is restricted. Interpretation is controlled. Their existence is acknowledged only indirectly, if at all. Over time, the public forgets not because the knowledge was disproven, but because it was never allowed to circulate. The emergence of forbidden books provides one of the clearest windows into this process. By the early centuries of the Common Era, religious authorities were already maintaining lists of texts deemed unacceptable for general readership. These were not trivial writings. Many addressed cosmology, origins, and humanity's relationship to higher powers. They offered alternative frameworks that reduced dependence on institutional mediation. The creation of such lists required careful evaluation. One cannot prohibit a book without first understanding its content. That means the very authorities who declared certain ideas dangerous were intimately familiar with them. The danger was not ignorance. It was comprehension. The most famous example is the Index of Prohibited Books, which operated for more than 4 centuries. Thousands of works were reviewed, categorized, and banned. Philosophical treatises, scientific explorations, mystical writings, historical analyses, all were scrutinized for deviation from approved doctrine. This was not chaotic censorship. It was systematic, scholarly, and deliberate. The question rarely asked is what happened to the banned texts themselves. In many cases, copies were not destroyed. They were retained in institutional libraries. Scholars needed access to them in order to refute them, monitor their influence, and prevent their resurgence. Suppression required preservation. This creates an uncomfortable paradox. The greatest collections of forbidden knowledge in the world are held by the same institutions that warned the public against that knowledge. Control did not mean ignorance. It meant monopoly. Nowhere is this more evident than in the great religious archives of Europe. Behind walls and locked doors exist vast repositories of manuscripts, correspondence, reports, and artifacts gathered over centuries of global contact. These collections were not assembled passively. They were curated by organizations that functioned as intelligence networks long before the modern state existed. Missionaries did not simply convert. They observed. They documented languages, rituals, cosmologies, and oral histories. They sent reports back to central authorities describing what indigenous peoples believed about creation, the sky, ancient beings, and past catastrophes. Much of this material never reached the public. Colonial administrators worked alongside clergy to assess local traditions. Some knowledge was deemed harmless folklore. Other knowledge was marked as dangerous. Dangerous knowledge was not always destroyed. Often, it was removed from local circulation and absorbed into European collections. The logic is simple. Destroying all evidence risks loss of control. Preserving evidence while restricting access ensures dominance. This practice extended beyond written texts. Artifacts were seized. Sacred objects were relocated. Instruments used in rituals were collected and studied. These were not random acts of looting. They were information-gathering operations. Indigenous accounts of global catastrophe offer a striking example of how this knowledge survived despite suppression. Across continents, cultures that never contacted one another preserved narratives describing a world-ending flood, fire from the sky, or a sudden collapse of the old order. These accounts share structural similarities too precise to dismiss as coincidence. In Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Oceania, stories describe warnings issued by powerful beings, chosen survivors, vessels, or refuges, and the rebuilding of civilization under external guidance. The names differ. The symbols vary. The sequence remains consistent. This consistency posed a problem for institutions invested in a singular origin narrative. If many cultures independently preserved memories of the same catastrophic event, then no single tradition could claim exclusive authority over human origins. Worse, some of these accounts explicitly described beings descending from the sky to assist humanity in recovery. Rather than engage with these implications, authorities dismissed the stories as myth. Myth became a category of irrelevance, a convenient container for information that did not fit established frameworks. Yet myth has never meant falsehood. It has meant narrative memory preserved through symbol. Ancient cultures encoded history in story precisely because story survives trauma better than record-keeping. When literacy collapses, myth remains. The global flood memory illustrates this principle vividly. Even where writing systems were destroyed, oral traditions preserved key elements. Even where colonization disrupted transmission, fragments endured. The Hebrew version of the flood is one among many. The Mesopotamian version predates it. Others preserve details the biblical account omits, disagreements among divine authorities, resistance to extermination, and technological assistance. African traditions add further layers. Some describe beings arriving to a world already covered in water, not merely surviving a flood but actively reshaping the planet to make it habitable. These beings are not portrayed as creators in the abstract sense. They are engineers, organizers, and teachers. In Southeast Asia, similar traditions persist. Accounts describe beings descending from above to bring order to chaos, separating land from water and instructing humanity in survival. These stories often emphasize collaboration rather than punishment. The Popol Vuh of the Maya preserves echoes of this memory despite catastrophic suppression. Feathered serpent beings hover over primordial waters. Creation unfolds through deliberation and experimentation. Failed attempts precede success. Humanity emerges through process, not instant perfection. These narratives directly contradict doctrines that insist humanity was created complete, fell once, and has been broken ever since. Instead, they depict humanity as developing, learning, and being assisted. The translation choices applied to biblical texts further obscure these connections. Words describing physical phenomena are rendered as spiritual abstractions. Terms referring to movement through air become spirit. Descriptions of hovering objects become metaphors. This is not accidental. It aligns the text with later theology at the cost of original meaning. Scholars who perform interlinear translations, rendering texts word for word without interpretive smoothing, consistently encounter this tension. The earliest meanings are concrete. The later interpretations are symbolic. The shift reflects ideology, not language. The decision to spiritualize physical description serves a specific function. It removes the possibility of material interaction. A God who is everywhere and nowhere cannot arrive or depart. A purely spiritual being cannot operate machinery, require sustenance, or intervene technologically. Abstraction protects doctrine. Yet abstraction also removes accountability. A being who cannot be located cannot be questioned. A system without structure cannot be challenged. This is precisely why earlier descriptions were problematic. The existence of classified archives suggests that institutions recognize the fragility of the official narrative. If alternative accounts were truly harmless, they could be released openly. If they were easily dismissed, they would not require protection. Instead, access remains restricted. Scholars are vetted. Permissions are limited. Entire categories of material remain uncatalogued publicly. Even within permitted access, navigation is difficult by design. Knowledge is present, but fragmented. This fragmentation mirrors the broader human condition. We inherit pieces of a story without the framework needed to assemble them. Cultures remember events but forget context. Texts survive but lose interpretation. Symbols persist but their reference fade. What remains consistent is the pattern of control. Information that empowers individuals to reinterpret their origins independently is always constrained. Information that reinforces dependency is amplified. This brings us back to the central question. Why was so much effort invested in managing humanity's understanding of its past? Because origin stories define destiny. If humanity believes it was created weak, it will seek external salvation. If it believes it was once greater, it may seek restoration. If it believes knowledge is dangerous, it will accept limitation. If it believes knowledge is inheritance, it will pursue it. Institutions built on obedience cannot tolerate the latter. The fragments that survived suppression hint at a different possibility. A humanity that was shaped through process. Assisted during catastrophe. Restricted afterward. Not fallen, but constrained. These ideas did not disappear because they lacked evidence. They disappeared because they offered too much agency. And yet, they never fully vanished. They wait in marginal texts, dismissed myths, untranslated manuscripts, and oral traditions passed quietly between generations. They wait for conditions under which asking forbidden questions becomes possible again. If fragments of this knowledge survived everywhere, then the final question is not whether it existed, but why its recovery is happening now, and what changes when humanity begins remembering what it was never meant to forget. The modern world often congratulates itself on transparency. Information appears abundant, instantly accessible, and endlessly replicated. Yet abundance does not equal freedom. In many ways, the contemporary era represents the most sophisticated system of information control humanity has ever experienced. Suppression no longer relies on fire or prohibition. It relies on saturation, fragmentation, and narrative framing. Truth is not erased, it is drowned. By the 20th century, institutions had learned a critical lesson from earlier failures. Open censorship creates resistance. Banned ideas attract attention. Forbidden books invite curiosity. But if information is released selectively, embedded within noise, or framed as fringe, it neutralizes itself. The public dismisses what it cannot easily categorize. This strategy coincided with the rise of intelligence agencies, classified research, and national security doctrine. Knowledge itself became a strategic asset. What was once guarded by priesthoods and monarchs was now guarded by bureaucracies and clearance levels. The language changed. The function remained. Classification did not exist to protect citizens from danger. It existed to protect power from destabilization. During the early Cold War, governments realized that public belief systems mattered as much as weapons. Ideology became a battlefield. Control of narrative determined legitimacy. In this context, ancient history, cosmology, and human origins were not neutral topics. They shaped identity. They shaped allegiance. And most importantly, they shaped obedience. Scientific institutions were not immune to this logic. Funding structures aligned research priorities with state interests. Topics that reinforced existing models received support. Topics that challenged foundational assumptions quietly lost backing. Careers were shaped accordingly. This does not require conspiracy. It requires incentives. A researcher who pursues dangerous questions risks marginalization. A researcher who reinforces accepted frameworks is rewarded. Over time, self-selection does the work of censorship. Entire fields drift away from uncomfortable inquiry without any explicit prohibition. The study of ancient civilizations illustrates this perfectly. Archaeology routinely encounters anomalies, structures that do not fit timelines, technologies that appear prematurely advanced, alignments that suggest astronomical knowledge exceeding expectations. These anomalies are documented, then explained away as coincidence, ritual symbolism, or lost primitive ingenuity. Rarely is the simplest explanation entertained, that earlier human societies may have inherited knowledge from an advanced precursor culture, or that external assistance played a role in early development. Such ideas threaten linear progress narratives. They challenge assumptions about human uniqueness. They destabilize modern identity built on technological superiority. So they remain marginal. The same pattern appears in cosmology. The universe grows more complex with each discovery. Dark matter, dark energy, unexplained acceleration, fine-tuning constants all suggest a reality far stranger than classical models predicted. Yet philosophical implications are carefully managed. Questions about intelligence beyond Earth are framed cautiously. Possibility is acknowledged without consequence. Official discourse walks a narrow line, open enough to appear honest, constrained enough to avoid disruption. This balancing act became increasingly visible with the emergence of unidentified aerial phenomena. For decades, governments denied interest, ridiculed witnesses, and dismissed reports. Then suddenly, acknowledgement shifted. Phenomena were real, unidentified, and technologically advanced. Yet no conclusions were drawn. This partial disclosure mirrors ancient patterns. Acknowledge presence. Withhold context. Maintain ambiguity. The question is not whether institutions know more than they reveal. The question is why revelation is controlled. The answer returns us to origins. If humanity discovers that its past includes intervention, restriction, or manipulation by non-human intelligence, the implications are profound. Religious narratives collapse. Political legitimacy weakens. Economic systems built on scarcity face existential challenge. Authority derived from claimed moral superiority dissolves. A species that understands it has been managed may no longer accept management. This is why disclosure proceeds slowly. Not because evidence is lacking, but because integration is dangerous. Ancient knowledge resurfaces now not by accident, but because the systems that suppressed it are weakening. Digital replication makes destruction impossible. Global communication bypasses centralized filters. Independent scholars collaborate across borders. Indigenous voices reclaim suppressed histories. What was once fragmented begins to reconnect. Patterns emerge across disciplines. Myth aligns with geology. Oral tradition aligns with archaeology. Textual anomalies align with astronomical data. Independent lines of evidence converge on the same conclusion: humanity's story is incomplete. More importantly, it was made incomplete. The realization that knowledge was withheld, rather than lost, changes everything. Loss implies tragedy. Withholding implies intent. Intent implies motive. Motive invites scrutiny. Institutions respond predictably. They frame rediscovery as speculation. They label synthesis as pseudoscience. They isolate fields from one another. They insist on disciplinary purity to prevent holistic understanding. Yet synthesis is exactly what ancient knowledge demands. Early civilizations did not divide astronomy from theology, engineering from ritual, or cosmology from governance. These were integrated systems. Separation is a modern imposition. As integration returns, control weakens. This explains the growing cultural fascination with ancient civilizations, lost knowledge, and forgotten technologies. These interests are not escapism. They are symptoms of a collective memory stirring beneath imposed narratives. People sense inconsistency. They sense omission. They sense that something fundamental has been withheld. The resurgence of interest in forbidden texts, alternative histories, and suppressed traditions is not rebellion, it is correction. Humanity is not seeking fantasy. It is seeking continuity. Continuity threatens systems built on discontinuity. If humanity remembers itself as resilient, adaptive, and knowledgeable, it becomes harder to govern through fear. If humanity understands that collapse and renewal are recurring patterns, apocalyptic control narratives lose power. And if humanity recognizes that knowledge was once shared freely, and then restricted deliberately, the legitimacy of modern gatekeepers erodes. This is why disclosure is managed rather than embraced. This is why ancient knowledge resurfaces indirectly, through entertainment, speculation, and fragmented leaks. Gradual exposure minimizes shock. But gradual exposure also accelerates curiosity. The cycle is nearing a threshold. Suppression systems designed for slower information environments struggle to adapt. Classification cannot compete with replication. Authority cannot compete with synthesis. And fear cannot compete with understanding. What emerges next depends on interpretation. Rediscovered knowledge can liberate or destabilize. It can empower or divide. Institutions know this. That is why they hesitate. But hesitation is not control. Humanity stands at a familiar point, one it has reached before. A point where memory returns, boundaries dissolve, and inherited limitations are questioned. Ancient texts describe this moment not as catastrophe, but as transition. Whether that transition leads to restoration or repetition depends on what humanity does with remembrance. Because knowledge does not merely inform. It transforms. If humanity was once restricted after remembering too much, then the final question is not what we are discovering, but whether we are prepared for what happens when those limits dissolve again. Every civilization that survives long enough eventually asks the same question: what are we capable of becoming? And beneath that question lies another, more dangerous one: who decides the answer? The ancient world did not approach this problem abstractly. It approached it through memory, through catastrophe, through warning. Across cultures that never met, stories emerged not merely about creation, but about limitation, limits placed on humanity after a moment of overreach, remembrance, or ascent. These stories are often misread as moral lessons. In reality, they read more like system safeguards. In the oldest traditions, humanity is not depicted as weak by design. It is depicted as becoming dangerous, too knowledgeable, too unified, too capable. The concern expressed is not sin, but autonomy. Not corruption, but acceleration. The story of the Tower of Babel is a perfect example. The people are not punished for cruelty, violence, or injustice. They are punished for coordination, for shared language, for collective intent. The divine response is revealing: nothing they plan will be impossible for them. That statement is not fear-driven hyperbole. It is assessment. And the solution is not destruction. It is fragmentation. Language is confused. Communication is broken. Humanity is scattered. Progress is slowed not by removing intelligence, but by isolating it. This is not moral judgment. It is strategic containment. The same logic appears elsewhere. In Mesopotamian traditions, humans are created to relieve the gods of labor, but when humans multiply and become disruptive, drastic action follows. In Greek mythology, fire, symbolizing knowledge and technology, is restricted, stolen, punished. In Mesoamerican texts, early versions of humanity are destroyed not because they are evil, but because they see too clearly. These are not metaphors invented randomly. They are warnings encoded in story. What these traditions share is a recognition that intelligence scales. Once a species reaches a certain threshold of cooperation and understanding, its trajectory changes irreversibly. Control must either be relinquished or enforced. The flood narratives represent one form of enforcement. The scattering narratives represent another. Lifespan reduction, environmental hostility, and hierarchical governance represent quieter mechanisms. The result is the same, reset without extinction. Importantly, humanity is never annihilated completely. It is preserved selectively. Knowledge survives in fragments. Certain lineages retain memory. Certain skills re-emerge faster than expected. Civilization restarts, not from zero, but from managed inheritance. This explains the persistent anomalies in the archaeological record. Sudden leaps in architecture. Advanced astronomy appearing early. Mathematical systems emerging fully formed. These are not miracles. They are remnants. What was once normal became exceptional. What was once widespread became rare. What was once shared became guarded. And over time, the story changed. Later civilizations reframed limitation as benevolence. Authority was described as protection. Obedience was described as virtue. Curiosity became danger. Knowledge became temptation. The narrative shifted from "you were capable" to "you are fallen." This shift was essential. A species that believes it was diminished by error seeks redemption through obedience. A species that believes it was diminished by design seeks restoration through understanding. Institutions built on mediation require the former belief. They cannot survive the latter. This is why so many traditions insist that the past was worse than the present. That ancient humanity was ignorant, savage, and primitive. That progress flows only forward. That regression is impossible. But the evidence contradicts this. Ancient sites demonstrate precision that rivals modern engineering. Astronomical alignments require long-term observation and mathematical sophistication. Geological markers align with mythic catastrophe timelines. These are not coincidences. They are signals. Humanity has been here before. And each time it approaches the same threshold, global connectivity, rapid technological growth. Diminishing institutional trust, the same questions resurface. Who are we really? What were we capable of? And why were we stopped? Modern society frames these questions as speculative or fictional. Yet the behaviors of power structures suggest otherwise. Surveillance increases as technology democratizes. Information is filtered as access expands. Artificial intelligence is regulated not because it is dangerous, but because it decentralizes capability. The pattern is unmistakable. Whenever humans gain tools that reduce dependency, whether through knowledge, technology, or coordination, authority tightens. Not always through force. Often through narrative. We are told limits are natural. That scarcity is inevitable. That hierarchy is unavoidable. That chaos follows autonomy. These claims are rarely tested. They are repeated. Ancient warnings, however, are not about punishment. They are about cycles. They describe what happens when limits fail. In some traditions, humanity reaches the heavens. In others, it speaks with gods as equals. In others, it manipulates the fabric of the world. And in nearly all, the response is the same: fragmentation, reset, restriction. The lesson is not do not advance. The lesson is advance responsibly, or expect correction. This is where modern interpretation often fails. The ancients were not advocating submission. They were advocating awareness. They understood that power without integration invites collapse, not because of moral failure, but because of systemic imbalance. If humanity advances faster than its capacity to manage consequence, intervention becomes inevitable, whether internal or external. This reframes the question of imposed limits entirely. Limits may not exist to prevent growth. They may exist to slow it until comprehension catches up. But there is a difference between temporary safeguard and permanent suppression. The tragedy of human history may not be that limits were imposed, but that they were never lifted. That what began as containment became control. That guidance became domination. If earlier intelligences, whether divine, advanced, or external, intervened to stabilize humanity during a volatile phase, the expectation may have been eventual release. But institutions that benefit from control rarely surrender it willingly. This is the unresolved tension at the heart of civilization. Are we still being protected? Or are we being managed? The resurgence of ancient knowledge suggests the latter. We are remembering too much, too quickly, for the old narratives to hold. Myths are aligning with science. Suppressed traditions are resurfacing. Authority structures are losing legitimacy. Global coordination is increasing despite fragmentation attempts. Language barriers dissolve digitally. Knowledge spreads horizontally. Gatekeeping weakens. This is Babel in reverse. And just as before, the threshold is approaching. The ancient warnings do not predict doom. They predict decision. Either humanity integrates power with responsibility or repeats the cycle. Either knowledge becomes collective wisdom or another reset becomes inevitable. The difference this time is awareness. Previous civilizations may not have understood why limits were imposed. We are beginning to. We can see the pattern. We can name the mechanisms. We can choose differently. But only if we abandon the belief that we are small, fallen, or incapable. Humanity's greatest limitation has never been intelligence. It has been memory. And memory is returning. The final question is not whether humanity will transcend imposed limits. It is whether it will do so consciously or be forced to start over once again. If the ancient cycles were warnings rather than myths, then the future does not depend on what we build next, but on what we finally remember about ourselves.